if what you want out of a public inquiry is to dig up some more dirt, point the finger at politicians who some believe for nefarious purposes were ignoring intelligence for their own political gain, to point the finger at very highly placed public servants who report to the current government. If you're looking to achieve something like that, I don't think you're going to find much at the end of the day. I think it's basically being exposed. There were no nefarious purposes at play here. There was no political controversy. There was no wrongdoing in the sense that the government willfully ignored or subverted intelligence for their own political gain.
Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. Our esteemed guests offer unique insights and analysis that you won't find anywhere else. In this week's episode, former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, Vincent Rigby, discusses safeguarding foreign interference, the intricate dynamics of national security, and the need for enhanced intelligence coordination. He also discusses the role of National Security Advisor and the potential for a public inquiry into foreign interference following Johnson's resignation as Special Rapporteur and its implications. This is the Expert Series. Mr. Rigby, it is a pleasure to have you on the program. Thanks for joining the CDA Institute's Expert Series today. Let's jump right in, shall we? With Johnson's resignation as Special Rapporteur, the assumption seems to be that a public inquiry is now inevitable. Given the fact that the intelligence at the center of this issue is classified, what can a public inquiry realistically achieve?
I think it's a great question, and it's at the heart of the matter right now as to whether we go with a full-out public inquiry, which, as you say, is looking more and more likely now that Johnson has stepped down. The government has kind of thrown it to the opposition parties to sort it out, and we're still waiting to hear back how they want to go. Or Johnson's suggestion that maybe we look at a compromise, not do nothing, but have some public consultations and see if we can get to the bottom of the matter through those consultations. What can be achieved with a public inquiry? At the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, well, what are you looking to achieve? And what is the outcome? And the problem I have right now is that I think an inquiry for the political class is really about, as Wes Wark has said, it's really about a highly politicized blame game. And so if what you want out of a public inquiry is to dig up some more dirt, point the finger at politicians who some believe for nefarious purposes were ignoring intelligence for their own political gain, to point the finger at very highly placed public servants who report to the current government. If you're looking to achieve something like that, I don't think you're going to find much at the end of the day. I think it's basically being exposed. There were no nefarious purposes at play here. There was no political controversy. There was no wrongdoing in the sense that the government willfully ignored or subverted intelligence for their own political gain. I don't think it was there. Were mistakes made? Absolutely. Mistakes were made. They've been exposed, I think, by Mr. Johnson. They've been exposed by the press. They've been exposed through PROC, the parliamentary committee. I've talked about some of those problems with respect to information sharing. But to spend 2.5 years on a public inquiry, a lot of money, a lot of process, and then wait probably another year for a government response. So you're talking about 3.5, 4 years before this all gets done. In the meantime, the problems aren't going to be solved. So what's going to be achieved? I don't think much is going to be achieved at the end of the day. And I think if you go this route, at the end of it, people are going to go, oh, okay, well, we haven't really found out that much more. Maybe a few more details, maybe not. I don't know. As you say, so much of this is going to be behind closed doors. That's not to say you can't do a public inquiry when there's highly classified intelligence. We've seen that with the Mahar inquiry. But the fact of the matter is a full public inquiry isn't going to happen. So I'm not big on the idea. I was initially, but it just has become more and more politicized. I just don't see the purpose at the end of the day. And to answer your question, I don't see there being a positive outcome coming out of it.
We don't exactly know when the next election will be. It might be sooner rather than later. Nonetheless, what can and needs to be done in the interim to ensure that we can counter foreign interference attempts in any upcoming elections?
I think we actually had some pretty good measures in place to prevent any foreign interference from becoming successful in in undermining the integrity of the political process. I think that the measures that the current government, set up a number of years ago, including the critical election incident public protocol, the panel of 5, those highly placed deputy ministers, the SITE, the Security Intelligence Threats to Election Task Force, the rapid response mechanism, those are still in place. And I think at the end of the day that they worked. You had 2 independent assessments done by former deputy ministers, one Jim Judd for the 2019 election, the other by Maurice Rosenberg for the 2021 election, who said that they effectively worked at the end of the day. And I don't think anybody is questioning that these elections were not free and fair. Yes, the Chinese were up to some shenanigans. Yes, the Chinese made a number of efforts, but at the end of the day, the elections worked. They were free and fair. And the government that was duly elected by Canadians got into power. So I think those processes work. Can you improve the way intelligence goes up through the system? Can the system be improved in a number of ways? Absolutely. And we'll probably get into that in a little bit more detail further on in the podcast. But I don't think that there's any need for Canadians to start panicking that our elections are under threat, in the sense that there's an existential threat. I don't believe that's the case. The Chinese, the Russians, others, they conduct foreign interference activities. The Chinese are particularly focused on our election process, and we have to be very conscious and very aware of those threats. But I honestly think the system works reasonably well, and that, we've learned some things from this process. We've learned some things from the leaks. We've learned some things from the Johnson report. We'll learn more from the NSIA report and the NSIA COP report. But it's pretty good what we have in place right now, and I think it'll continue to work as we move further down the line.
You've previously described the way in which important intelligence is flagged by CSIS as ad hoc and inconsistent. What needs to happen to be able to implement a more robust and consistent system, and how would such a system equally apply to other intelligence agencies as well?
I talked about this before Proc a couple of weeks ago. It's probably why you're asking the question, because I flagged it then. So I came right out at the gates and said, listen, the system is not perfect. I knew it when I was there. I think other NSIAs, other heads of intelligence agencies knew that there were problems. There were a couple of reports that came out, one late in 2021 by CG, another by Ottawa U, which I co-authored in 2022, stating that there were a number of problems with intelligence information sharing inside the government. I mean, I saw it firsthand as NSIA. The intelligence community produces a ton of intelligence. It's unbelievable how much crosses your desk. And I think I said before Proc that in my 18 months in the job, which is not a huge amount of time, I've read somewhere between 6, 7, 10,000 documents. I mean, it's incredible, and that's a small fraction of the total amount that is circulated. So all this intelligence is out there. There's signals intelligence, there's human intelligence. There are assessed reports done by organizations like the International Assessment Secretariat and IAB, the Intelligence Assessment Bureau, and CSIS. And so senior decision makers get overwhelmed. They get absolutely overwhelmed. And the problem with the system up to now is that there is no formal way of flagging particularly important or actionable intelligence. And every deputy, every senior decision maker, everyone at the political level, whether it's in PMO or a minister, looks at the intelligence in a different way. And there's been, I think, a lack of a system whereby we actually flag particularly important intel that needs action, that needs a discussion. 2, we don't have necessarily the discussion on a regular basis at the bureaucratic or the officials level. And 3, we don't have the discussion at the political level on a regular, consistent basis. So I think first of all, we need to have a system that flags the intel. And so if a particularly important piece of intel is circulated by CSIS or by CSE or by some of the other bodies that I just mentioned on the assessment side, you actually pick up the phone and call the relevant decision makers and say, you really should look very carefully at this piece of intel, or it is flagged, like literally flagged, like put some kind of a note on it that this is particularly important, this is particularly sensitive. So we need that formal system to do that. And then I think we need to discuss it at senior levels inside the bureaucracy. And so I tried to take a step in that direction when I was the NSIA. I created a body known as the DMIC, the Deputy Minister's Intelligence Committee, which was formerly the Deputy Minister's Intelligence Assessment Committee, which focused exclusively on strategic intelligence assessments. And what I wanted the DMIC to do was to focus not on just assessed intel, but also raw intel, intel that was coming directly out of CSIS through human reports or CSE through intercepts that was important, that was actionable, and that we thought might need to be flagged for the political level. And so we were having regular discussions every couple of weeks at the DMIC to dig our teeth into that and decide what to do with it. And as I said before the committee, it had only been up and running for 6 months by the time I left. It wasn't perfect. I do not remember us having a discussion about all the intelligence related to Mr. Chong, for example. So clearly it was not a success, but it was moving in the right direction. And my understanding is that Jody Thomas, my successor, has now created a new body which meets on a regular basis, which focuses exclusively on that type of intelligence, has a sit down amongst deputies every, I don't know how often, but on a regular basis to go, okay, here's 15, 20 pieces of intel. Some of it looks like maybe we should be flagging it up the chain. What do you think? Let's have that discussion. So if that's happening, I think that's a really good move, and we should continue to do it. The last point that I'd make in terms of improving the system is that even if you flag the intel for the political level, you still have to have a discussion at the political level. And the problem right now is that everybody's being briefed in a siloed way. So the NSIA briefs the prime minister, individual ministers get briefed by their organizations. Mendocino gets briefed by David Vigneault at CSIS. Anand gets briefed by the head of CSE. You're not getting all of the key ministers with the prime minister sitting down on a regular basis and getting briefed on the same intel with the same take on that intel, and then discussing what to do about it. And so I've argued quite vociferously for a cabinet committee on national security, that's what you need to have these discussions, so that the prime minister is getting briefed the way his ministers are getting briefed, and he's sitting down with the ministers and having a discussion like, okay, we just got briefed by CSIS on foreign interference, and it looks like an MP or his family has been targeted. Let's talk about the intel. Let's see how credible it is. Let's get the views of the agencies, but then let's decide what we want to do. You're not having those discussions at the political level, not on a regular basis. And so I think you need a body like that. We're the only country in the Five Eyes that does not have some kind of national security type committee or an agency chaired by the head of government, the prime minister, in the case of the United States, the president. So I think we need that as well to help improve the system. So those are just a few ideas about ways that we could channel the intelligence up through the bureaucracy and into the political level on a more efficient, effective basis.
You have stated in the past that the role of National Security Intelligence Advisor needs a second look because of its limited authority in coordinating the security and intelligence community. Could you build off of this a bit more, perhaps describing how the role could be improved or be made to be more efficient?
Absolutely. And again, I think I don't want to pick on the NSIA. I was the NSIA, so I've got a little bit of personal experience, but I mean, I think we need to review the entire S&I community, and I think we need a comprehensive national security review. We need a new national security strategy, which we haven't had since 2004. So we need to look at everything. But what I suggested is that the NSIA in particular needs, as you say, to have the hood popped and look at the engine and look at all the component pieces and see if it can work a little bit better. And I've suggested this because the NSIA is at the center of the S&I system, the S&I structure, and that position basically has three roles: to provide intel and to advise on policy matters the prime minister, to try and coordinate the S&I community inside Canada, so those 10 or 12 members of the core system plus all the others as well. But then also to work with allies, to work with the public, to work with various stakeholders. So there are three different roles that I had as my priority. One of the problems is that the job's been around with its current moniker for about 20 years. There was an S&I coordinator inside PCO before that, dating back to the late 20th century. But the NSIA, that formal position that came out of the national security policy in 2004, it's been around for 20 years. In fact, I think it's going to be its 20th anniversary next year. So after 20 years, let's see how well it's worked. Let's take a bit of a look back and see what its strengths and weaknesses have been, and let's take a look forward in terms of the current security environment, which I think everybody agrees is very dangerous, is very unpredictable. We're going through a really, really difficult time in the world right now. Is it equipped to take on those challenges both at home and at overseas? I mean, one of the problems I've had with the national security and intelligence advisor's role is that each incumbent has approached the position a little bit differently. So I just told you the 3 roles for me, but you could ask another national security advisor from the past and they go, well, I focused on this or I focused on that. They may fundamentally agree with those 3 roles, but they might add 1 or 2 others, or they might subtract one that I had. Maybe they didn't deal a lot with outside stakeholders. I think you need some consistency in terms of the approach, and consistency in terms of what they actually controlled. You don't have always in the NSIA role a big sandbox to play in. So in the past, some NSAs, as they were known then, they didn't have the intelligence as part of the title. Some NSAs only had the Security and Intelligence Secretariat and IAS report up to them. They didn't have the Foreign and Defense Policy Advisor reporting up to them. Then that was changed a number of years ago by an NSA. And that's the case for Jody Thomas right now as the current National Security and Intelligence Advisor. She has both of those positions reporting up. So both the more domestic and the international sides. For me, I only had the domestic piece primarily on the S&I side. I didn't have the Foreign Defense Policy Advisor reporting up to me, which in retrospect I think was a mistake. And so just some consistency there. Are you going to have that full gamut or not? Are you going to have the resources to support the job at the end of the day? If it's only the S&I secretariat, it's only about 15, 20 people. It's incredibly small. I think that the current NSIA's gambit has expanded quite a bit. She has emergency management under her now. She has a deputy NSIA just being appointed. She has a foreign interference advisor person under her as well. I'm not sure the relationship between that position and the one at public safety. So it's like an accordion. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. Over the last 20 years, sometimes it's being expanded and sometimes it's being contracted. So get some consistency in that regard. Make sure that you've got the right number of resources. Look at the authorities for the NSIA. Right now, the NSIA doesn't have a lot of authority. Now, some of the position holders in the past will tell you that, well, I was okay. I had enough authority. I could convince, I could cajole, I could invoke the name of the prime minister. But others, such as me, found that their hands were sometimes tied. They were frustrated in trying to get people to do things because you could basically say to the NSIA, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that." And in some respects, that's understandable because DMs all have their accountabilities up to their individual ministers, so they can't be taking orders from other deputy ministers. But the NSIA is a special role, and I think you've got to acknowledge that it is a special role. It's a special role without any legislative basis, though. Most deputy ministers their positions are enshrined in their department's legislation. The NSIA has no legislation. Positions at the center traditionally are not in legislation. Only the clerk is in legislation, deputy secretaries, et cetera, and NSIAs don't. But I think you need to look at that. So that's a long answer and kind of all over the map. And that probably speaks volumes, just the way that I've answered it, in as much as traditionally over the last 20 years or so, the job has been up and down and swinging from left to right in terms of roles, responsibilities, mandate, authorities, et cetera. It's time to go, okay, after 20 years of experience, what do we want this job to do? Let's have a very, very clear sense of how we want it to move forward. Again, in a world that is so complicated, that is so challenging, and there are so many different threats out there, we need a strong national security and intelligence advisor. And one other thing, I know this is a very long-winded answer. Do you want to change the structure a little bit at PCO in the sense that you've got an NSIA who does policy and intelligence? You don't usually combine those two. You have someone provide the intelligence, then the policy side is the decision maker working on that intelligence and briefing up to the prime minister. Right now, you have the NSIA wearing both hats. I probably spend more time with my intelligence hat on than my policy hat. And that can be difficult at times. And a lot of other countries have looked at our model and go, does that work? Because that's not the way you traditionally do it. You don't mix up policy and intelligence. So I've suggested, and this I think would also help solve the problem with respect to the intelligence sharing issue? Do you want to create a figure like you have in the US, a director of national intelligence at the center, who brings in all the intel from across the system and fuses it, integrates it, and then reports it up to the prime minister or reports it up to a cabinet committee, and would have a dotted line to the NSIA, but would not necessarily report directly to the NSIA, so would have that freedom to produce independent intelligence and then have the NSIA deputy ministers working off that. So I think that's something worth exploring. Not everyone's going to support it. People say, well, it may work in the US system, but it's not going to work in the Canadian system. But as I say, it might lessen the workload for the NSIA. It might clarify the accountabilities of the NSIA, policy versus intelligence. And I think most importantly, it would help solve that information sharing issue, because again, it's the siloed intel going up. You need it fused at the center with a stronger capability within PCO to move it up.
Well, Mr. Rigby, thanks for joining me today. You've been excellent. Before we wrap up this interview, I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts on any subjects we've discussed, or if there's anything we didn't discuss that you think might be important to incorporate into the ongoing debates and conversation around these issues.
I think that the last point that I'd make, and it's the point that I made to Proc. I'm very glad that we're having a debate on national security publicly. I'm very glad that we're having a debate on intelligence, because I've said on many occasions, we don't have the most mature security intelligence culture in Canada or in government. And it's been a long time since we've aired all of this stuff publicly. So it's great that we're finally doing it. I have two issues, though, with the way the debate is currently being conducted. The first is that it's horrible that it had to occur through the leaking of intelligence. And so, again, I want to go on the record saying that I condemn in the strongest possible terms whoever leaked this information. This is not the way to do it. It undermines national security. It gives comfort to our hostile state actors, enemies, and it potentially puts lives at risk. So this is not the way to do it. We need to do it in a more methodical, thought out way with proper processes, and not have it be so politicized. And I guess that would be my second point, is that because of the way this information has come out, it's so politicized now. It's all about scoring political points. It's become a bit of a debacle, and it's become less and less about our national security and security intelligence, and more about parties taking shots at each other and personalities becoming front and center. So it's very unfortunate that for the last couple of months, David Johnson has become the issue and not actually the future of national security in Canada. And that's really, really unfortunate. And you can take shots at the government for choosing David Johnson. You can take shots at David Johnson for accepting the offer. But I guess I would just make a plea to move beyond that now. I hope we don't go with a public inquiry, but I have a feeling that's where we're going to go. But let's stop looking back. Let's stop looking to blame, to shame senior officials, politicians. I think we know what the problems are. Let's focus on the future and fixing the problems that we have. And again, I referred to the two reports that came out from Ottawa U, myself and Thomas Juneau as co-authors, the CG report, Wes Wark and Aaron Schultz, which highlighted almost all of these problems. And if people had read those reports then, they would not be shocked and surprised by what they're hearing. These problems have been there for a while. So let's focus on going after the problems as they exist. Let's have a full up review of our national security policy and a new security policy statement. Let's take a look at the specific tools that need to be changed, including updating the CSIS Act and information sharing and all of that stuff. Let's fix those problems. Let's improve the governance. I talked to you about that in terms of a cabinet committee or NSIA and what have you. And let's improve the transparency of the system, because that's also one of the problems right now. We do not have enough transparency. We don't have public threat reports. We don't respond to NSI COP reports. We don't brief parliamentarians on the threats, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's focus on fixing the system and looking forward, as opposed to looking back and looking for scapegoats. That's not that's not the way to go. So that would be my final word on the topic this morning.
Mr. Rigby, thanks. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully we can continue this conversation in the future. Thanks so much. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at CDA Institute or to subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.